Welcome to the Public Figure Society podcast, where innovation meets influence. If you're building a brand, leading a movement, or shaping the future, you are in the right place. We bring you the insights, strategies, and stories that fuel the world's most impactful public figures. It is time to step up, stand out, and leave your mark. Let's dive in. Part 2, welcome guys. We are talking about the age of Regenesis and kind of the foundation of why I started the podcast, Public Figure Society. It really came about the discussion with Jeremy, but also with my own personal experience, seeing how AI is becoming this invisible workforce, lifting me up in many ways. I'm saving a lot of times when I'm translating books, and some people are saying that my position is irrelevant right now because of things, and some of it is going to be irrelevant because AI has come here. And so we're just going to continue the conversation. So Jeremy, if you could just give a little bit of a summary of what we talked about on the last podcast, just about how we're throwing seeds in the next 40 years.
Yeah, well, we spent the last podcast talking about societal seasons: spring, summer, fall, and then winter. And in winter, old institutions of society die down, and it gives an opportunity for new stuff to be planted for the spring. And it's in the spring when all this new life is coming forth. From a society standpoint, we're looking at 80 to 100 year cycle. And what that means is we're looking at the beginning of the next 80 to 100 years economic cycle, societal cycles where all these different trends will develop over the next 100 years. Like, all this stuff is happening right now. And just as a quick, reference to some of the stuff, last cycle that we went through, the Federal Reserve central banking was the new cycle, and that's dominated the last 100 years. That institution is dying off, whether people realize it yet or not. It is. That institution,
and also health institutions too.
That the health industry, as we know it today, is a 20th century concept. This is an idea that was part of the last cycle. Higher education, as we know it today, is an idea from the last 100-year cycle. And so you can see all these different cycles, and there's about 8 or 10 that we've identified. I'm sure there's a lot more. But all of these are just part of society, the rise and fall. And it's not bad. It's like King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. All you have to do is look back and realize that every 80 to 100 years we go through one of these cycles. And what the age of Regenesis is about is we're in the middle of that small window between the end of winter and the beginning of spring, where we're literally just casting seeds and planting for the new cycle. It's really exciting.
Yeah, so it's a time, I think it's the entrepreneurial age, really. It's the entrepreneurial's wet dream, if we're going to say it any other way.
Well, you said it. If I said it, it would have been bad,
Yeah, I know, but it's just like it is. You're dreaming. You're like, oh my gosh, I can just see everyone salivate. And this is the time when the Carnegies and all those guys were developed, right? They're
well, in the following the Civil War cycle, that was 2 cycles ago. But that was the period that we know as the Gilded Era. It led to the industrialization age, and it planted the seeds for what became the last cycle. And the last cycle has planted the seeds for what's this next cycle that we're getting into.
Right. So this is a moment in time of opportunity, and I've sensed it in my profession, working in communications and public relations and worked in public affairs. You're seeing, like, how do you become a public affair person right now when everything's changing, like USAID completely down, which was an infrastructure for all of society's fundraising, nonprofits. It wasn't the only one, but it's a culture of ways of doing things that are changing. And I think that's a really fascinating thing. So what we're talking about now is why Public Figure Society. And I would love to get some of your ideas before I go into it. But where do you see the individual right now in this moment in time? Because you have a lot of interesting theories about what's going to happen to the individual, which is kind of wrapping itself into this Public Figure Society, because we have to look at ourselves completely different now.
This is one of my favorite trends that I see shifting. It keeps me up at night with excitement because I think about how much opportunity we have and what an amazing time. I said on the previous podcast, I'll say it on this one. This is the greatest time in world history. We've often heard, hey, we're alive at the greatest time ever. You are alive at the greatest time ever. In 50 years, if you fast forward to 2050, 2080, people are going to look back and say, I wish I could have been alive at 2025 to 2030. just like, for many of my years, I thought, hey, it sure would have been cool to be alive in the Great Depression and experience all that. And as a kid, I thought,
you actually wanted to experience that?
Yeah, I did, because, first of all, as a boy and as a kid, you glamorize war. But from an industrialization standpoint, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, I saw that as a season as I became, I'm talking about as an adult, like as I became of age, I was like, man, if I could go back to the 1940s and build businesses, because the institutions that I was admiring at the time, this was in the 90s, but when I was looking back, I was like, hey, those were the institutions that were started in 1945, 1950. I wanted to be part of that. Yeah. And that's what people have glamorized. Even until recently, what has been the ideal? The ideal has been, if you can go to school, get an education, get a job, you can go work for a great company like an IBM, 20th century company. You can go work for a great company like fill in the blank, Xerox, Kodak, who missed the patent on digital cameras and is no longer with us. But you think about, what was the ideal? The ideal was you go work for an institution. And we don't usually use that term, but that's exactly what it is. It's an established institution. In business cycle, business cycles go through this season of infancy, and then kind of a teenage season, and then kind of a young adult season, if you will, just using that same metaphor. And then when the business is in its prime, that's when everybody realizes this business is amazing, and then they become institutionalized. Look at insurance. Insurance is like the most institutionalized industry ever. But if you like the idea of insurance, when you're coming of age, you're thinking, if I could get the right education, I can go work for that institution because it represents security. It represents certainty. Those institutions are now dying. And that's what's scary to people, but that's what's exciting to me because it's a huge opportunity.
It is a huge opportunity, and it's interesting because I lived in the corporate world of institutions, and I like the process. With Alvin Toffler, who was the one that wrote Future Shock, a very groundbreaking book 50 years ago, basically about how do you deal with society as the way it is now, and he kept saying this. Part of his quote was, "You need to unlearn to learn, and you need to relearn," and that really took to heart when I read that quote like last week, because I realized I have to unlearn a lot of stuff that I was taught. And I don't want to be like my grandma all the time. I remember when it was like this, right? Because you end up doing that. Like, I did this, I did that, and it doesn't have any relevance for today. All of us are just starting on ground zero again. You can take some of that experience, but what I think has been very fascinating is how industries are completely changing, and
yes.
how do we manage towards that? Like when I was in corporate, I had to write a press release. It was a certain kind of language, and it had to be perfect. And if it wasn't perfect, you got fired, right? Anything you were doing, it was all this expected of being perfect. The imperfection part of society came with Facebook and all of these beta testing and kind of like testing on the fly, and it was so refreshing. But in corporate, you still had to be perfect. Everything had to be perfect. And the pressure of that, and not only that, but there was a pressure of being the corporate code. How am I going to be behaving in that? That's kind of like where you have Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, or you have Machiavelli for women, or Princessa for women. How do you deal with the corporate power structure? Because there's a certain way of being. Some people last forever and some people don't, right? And so there is, how do you deal with the corporate jungle? And a lot of the sacrifice you make in that is you lose yourself.
I love that as a jumping point here. Several things you said. I want to come back to the corporate model because I want to spend a lot of time on that. You mentioned Facebook, and Facebook and social media is probably the best, most obvious example of the old institutions dying and new institutions coming in. The old institution was traditional media. When you look at the last 20th century cycle, you look at the rise of television, you look at the rise of, started off 8 tracks, records, cassettes, CDs. I mean, I'm old enough, you're old enough to remember when we used to drive around with cassettes, right? I'm old enough to remember when we had a cassette adapter and we would connect our CD Walkman with a wire running into the cassette adapter, right? Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that one.
So I saw a great video the other day. They were showing some Gen Z kids. Gen Z, so these kids are like 18, right? 20. Yeah. And they were showing them an old school boombox. And it was like, how do you make this thing work? And they were like looking at it and they're like, it looks like a dash of a car. Like, what do you, and people, they couldn't figure out how to turn it on. They're like, what's this jack that says phone? It's a little 1/8" headphone jack. They're like, I don't know. Is it, you connect the telephone? Like, it was two different worlds to them. They don't get it. But anyway, I digress.
But it's kind of hard for us. And I think this is where we got to give ourselves grace. The people that are Gen X and millennials, I think we put ourselves too much pressure on ourselves to not realize how much has actually changed. And I think, and that's what I wrote a couple chapters in my book, things really have changed, and honor the change. Like, I'll never forget when I was, and I knew what a day runner was, but I had a client of mine that was, I was like, I missed an appointment because something got wrong with my calendar. And I said, I'm so sorry. And she goes, well, that never happens to me because I use my day runner. And I haven't heard of the word day runner since the mid 90s. So I'm like asking her, what is a day runner? I was like, I can't believe I forgot it. I forgot what a day runner was. And it was just so interesting. And I was reading up on day runners then, this is what happens in a company falling, or you're falling out of society, right? So day runner was the number one way of keeping yourself organized. Then you got the Palm Pilot in, right?
Yeah.
But day runner was still there, but then social media comes in, and what happens is it was the highest point like this, and within 2 or 3 years it went down to bottom. Yeah. And a VC company bought them up to accommodate for the boomers that are still using the day runner planner, right? And so it's just fascinating to me how quickly this goes. And I think this is why it's so important that when we're in this age, there's only 4 years for you to really plan, 4 years to you really to, as we're saying with the Regenesis, to plant seeds and to allow yourself to be creative in creating a new way of thinking. Because when that starts becoming institutionalized, those new ideas, then it's going to be harder for you to really create. It's almost like with TikTok, right? The golden age of TikTok. If you had been on there before then, you could just like get yourself to be like an influencer like in no time, right? But now you're crawling because you're with everyone competing. So now is the real time.
I don't want it to be so narrow that people think you only have a 4-year window. It's just that this is the 4-year optimum window. 4 to 6 years is what you're looking at.
But you have this optimum moment in time.
I love to use the metaphor of seeds. You can plant your watermelon seeds in May, and you'll still be able to get some watermelons by late August or September. But if you start planting your watermelon seeds in March, you're going to get 2 more months worth of harvest.
Right.
So it's just, it's about the optimal time is the next 4 to 6 years. But, businesses are born all the time. Opportunities are born all the time. Just going back to my media metaphor here, television, film, audio, radio, the way that we knew it, books, the way that we knew it, all of that has transitioned. The new platform for authors is blogging and it's digital writing. And the new platform for audio is podcasts. Years ago, I remember buying motivational CDs from Jim Rohn and Tony Robbins, and they were all CDs. My first Tony Robbins listening experience was cassettes. Believe it or not. Right? What?
Mine was an app because I just discovered him like 6 years ago.
Well, see, you're the new generation, but I'm old school. But television, and that has moved to Netflix. It's moved to actually. Do you realize that people like Dude Perfect on YouTube have a bigger influence than television series have really ever had? I mean, Dude Perfect will release a video and they'll have 50 million viewers.
I don't even know what that is.
Well, you don't, but if you had kids, they'd know exactly what it is because that's all they watch. And they'll have 50 million viewers in less than a week. And it used to be, oh my gosh, yeah.
What is it?
Oh, it's really incredible. You have to watch it. It's Dude Perfect.
It's D Perfect?
Dude.
Dude Perfect.
It started off as doing trick shots, and now they do full blown production every show. It's incredible.
So it's like Mr. Beast.
Yeah, very very similar but different. But my point is that social media has made it so anybody can enter the field. Used to be we had all these gatekeepers. We don't have those gatekeepers anymore. The gatekeeper is your password that you assign. Like if you want to write a book, how hard is it to get it on Amazon and publish it? It's not that hard.
No, but it's interesting you say that because that's one of the things I write about the book is that Kodak was the social media before social media was even there. Because they created something called the Brownie, and the Brownie was a little camera for everyone. So what what Kodak really did was it democratized photography, and you could never close the Pandora's box and control it again. So government could not control it, and so there's no certification in photography. Everyone can do photography, and it's open to everyone, right? That was the lesson that government learned, so that when new inventions of TV, radio came on board, and film, they create all these certifications to make it difficult for people to actually get those creativities, because they saw how dangerous it was for people to actually have a brownie. And what's really fascinating is that the only photo we really have of from the Titanic sinking was taken by a brownie.
Really? How fascinating.
And it created all this community, right? So it was really I say it was the social media before social media, but what it really shows is that we're all social, and if we can share creativity and open the creativity, people are going to stay creative and give. And so they could never control photography after that.
Yeah.
But they could control TV, radio, and so forth, because the government learned their lesson.
Interesting. So social media is the best, most obvious example of a new institution that's taken over the old. Old media is gone. Like, the worst place you could put your money right now is to start a media network like a Fox News or a CNN. Like, just don't do it. I mean, Elon Musk could pull it off. This is a side note. I saw a stat. I may have sent it to you. If you earned $100,000 a day, every day since the time of Jesus, you still wouldn't have as much money as Elon Musk. So he could do it. He has some extra money to throw around. But for the rest of us, old media is gone and new media is here. You have to embrace it.
Van Jones says. So Van Jones, CNN host, basically said the mainstream media is the fringe media. And that really captured my attention. It's like, wow, they're recognizing it now. And you're suddenly seeing all these people that are jumping off, like Chris Acosta, jumping off to have their own station because they're learning from Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson.
The original was Glenn Beck. I mean, love him or hate him, what he set out and did with Blaze is actually, that's the new media. That is the platform. Right. It's a beautiful example. And honestly, with all due respect to my elders, and I love my parents, but once that generation is dead, old school media would be dead forever. They're the only ones that give it any real credence anymore.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So you're in the last 10 years probably of the life cycle of old school media. So, I mean, you may still have some broadcast stuff, but it will be more like, we broadcast over YouTube now. Right. I mean, you and I have talked about starting media networks, and we're talking about doing everything decentralized. Everything will be through social outlets. Right. So let me go to the big one here, the one that really ties into your personal brand. In 2020, at the peak of 2020, I started seeing these trends. And I recognized, because I've been following this whole fourth turning idea, the winter's shifting to spring. I've been following that whole concept for 10 years at that point. And when it happened, I was like, oh my gosh, this is happening. And everybody was freaking out. And I did, at that time, we put together some online summits. We called it the Calm in the Storm Summit, trying to just get everybody calmed down. That's what the Regenesis Summit is going to be. It's going to be the opposite now. Okay. So back then it was kind of forward looking. And I laid out all the stuff that was happening. And one of the things I laid out then is I laid out that global corporations, as we've known it for the 20th century, are dying. And the future is going to be global communities. And I want to talk about that for a minute. But before I talk about that, let's talk about the global corporation dying. For the last 80 to 100 years, the individual has been the least important aspect of the corporation. It's wrong, but it's been the reality. It's been how they've operated. And if the corporation gets in trouble, what do they say? The corporation is more important than the individual. We will cut the workforce to save the corporation. And so you go through all these waves of layoffs, and everybody's aware of it. We've all experienced it or seen it. If we haven't personally experienced it, we've seen it. And that is the old model of global corporatism. The corporation is the king. And what I want to tell everybody that's listening is they are no longer the king. You are the king and you are the queen. You are the ones that matter more than any time in history. They need you. All of the old structures have almost completely crumbled at this point. I consulted with somebody a couple of weeks ago. He got laid off from Caterpillar. And Caterpillar was doing some restructuring from their department, and he got laid off, and he was just devastated. And I told him, I said, this is the greatest thing that could ever happen to you, because you were literally married to an old ideal that's about to completely decompose. Like, it's just falling apart before your eyes. And that's what I want people to understand. If you think that the idea is to go to school, get an education, so that you can go get a corporate job, you're holding on to the past. Since 2020, I don't know if you know these stats, since 2020, well, let me back into it. Did you notice in 2020 when they sent everybody home and nobody could work, did you notice that nobody went back to work? Like you go to McDonald's or fast food restaurant, retail outlets, and they're all understaffed, and they've been understaffed now for 5 years. Have you noticed that? You know why? Because 1 in 3 Americans never went back to work. 1 in 3 Americans all went into the gig economy. They started doing social stuff like what you're doing here and monetizing that. You've seen the rise of citizen journalism. You've seen the rise of the Etsy store, the Amazon stores, alternative ways to make money. Maybe they're driving for Uber or Uber Eats or, they're doing various ways, but they're all doing gigs that are not part of the old corporate ideal. 1/3 of the American society went there, and they did it because the government forced them there. When we talk about societies are changing, that's the cool thing. We say you can't stop it. The government forced it. They didn't even mean to. They said, everybody go home. You can't work because we got COVID. And what was the natural reaction? People said, well, I still got to make money. And they discovered the alternative gig economy. And we've never recovered from it. That is the perfect bridge to realize why the personal brand is so important. Because as we make this transition from corporate global corporations are the king over to the individual as the king, now people realize that you're not just putting a social media profile together. What you're putting together is you're putting together your branding for you, empire you, whatever you want to call it. And that empire,
I always say media conglomerate. You are a media conglomerate. You're more than yourself. But what I realize is the limitation. This is where I come to the realization of the limitation of the fame revolution, because the limitation of it is the fact that I was just thinking you need to become famous for what you do. But it's so much more than that. You are more than just the fame. You are basically a global corporation. You yourself, your personhood is. And it's really about understanding you're not a branded house, you are a house of brands.
Yes.
And what that really means is, in marketing terms, is that the branded house is kind of like a brand that everything looks the same. You have the same template. It's like almost like if Chick-fil-A was going to start doing hamburgers, they'd probably still have the same colors, right? It's like you're staying the same. I can't really think of a good branded house like McDonald's. It's all the same, right? Everything is the same. You stick to the brand. That's what the old way of doing it was. And I operated that way. And it was challenging because I was in the midst of that changing. Like, I was controlling everything when I was working. And then suddenly I had to give people more and more freedom because it doesn't work that way. Like, the hierarchy of the way you used to work doesn't work anymore. And so then what happens is we are becoming like these corporations where it's house of brands. Like, we are a P&G. We are P&G where you have a little bit of Colgate, you have Tide, and you have all of these different products that go into one component.
So what you just described in business terms are verticals or, multiple brands. And I'm going to put this in personal finance terms.
Sure.
Multiple sources of passive income.
Yes.
Let's deduce it down to where the average everyday person can understand, what does this mean? I don't want to be a global corporation. Yes, you do. You don't want to be a global corporation the way you think about it. But what you want to be, if you look at the wealthiest people in society, the wealthiest people over the last 500 years who've built a wealth dynasty and they've passed it to the next generation, what did they do? They didn't all go out and become doctors. What they did is they bought assets. I call them cash flowing assets. It could be in the form of real estate. It's in the form of diversity is what it is. I mean, there's all sorts of diversified cash flowing assets. They'll own, on a small scale, they will own, car washes, vending businesses, a little media empire, a little of this, a little real estate empire, a little bit of something over here. And then in the midst of that, they have kind of their token job that is kind of their identity. But their infrastructure for their finances is actually all these different sources of small businesses that are flowing in. That's a perfect model for the small person. If you just scale that up, you scale that up to a Trump empire, what do they got? They got lots and lots of hotels, but they also have the winery, and they have all these different little businesses that most people don't even realize the Trump empire has. And look, Donald's father started some of it. Trump Donald J. Trump has a bunch of it. Now Don Jr.'s taking it over. You've got a wealth dynasty that's getting passed down from generation to generation because they're teaching their kids something different that, as Robert Kiyosaki would say, the middle class hasn't taught their kids. The poor middle class hasn't taught. This is an age where Robert Kiyosaki's message is coming full circle. It's a season for diversified passive income. The small person is now the big leader. The small individual can be the person who goes out and builds an empire that people don't even realize is there. And that's the crazy thing. You don't even realize, looking around you, you don't know how many people you're looking at that are multimillionaires with multiple sources of passive income. They're just not flaunting it. You just have no idea.
I think this is what's so important, though, because I was at a networking event yesterday, and you're seeing the reflection of having 4 different passive incomes, right? And you're listing all of it. And then what happens is, what I like so much about what Donald Miller talks about is the brain doesn't want to use much calories on consuming information. It wants to use as little as possible. So if you suddenly have one person with 4 different options, you don't have any way of consuming it. You have no way of wanting to say yes to it. So what this really comes down to, and this is why I think personal branding itself is dead. You have to look at your brand as a corporate brand, and you look at the various components. So some corporations just have one brand one way. Simple. You're like, if you're a mechanic, car mechanic, you're one thing, right? But other people are going to have a lot of other assets. But if you're a car mechanic and you're suddenly doing real estate, you got to have 2 different brands. And then the thing that unifies it is you. So you're the P&G, right? And then you can help translate this possibly to make it easier. But then you have these smaller companies. So like, what I like so much is what I call the Donald Miller strategy, which he hasn't really come up with, but I've just been studying him, is that he will create presence of websites, own different companies that have completely different looks, like from story brand to coach builder to his personal brand of being a speaker. They don't even intersect. They're completely separate, so that clients that want to have story brand, where you want to learn how to write messaging, which I'm a big fan of. It's a fantastic book on how to do it. You go through his green look, but then if you want to be a coach and you suddenly see him on an advertisement as a coach, because he'll make ads that go completely to you as a coach, you get the coach builder, which I never really got. I just found it when I was doing research on him. So what we as people right now, we are a bigger corporate entity with different brands. It's going to take more work, because what you're doing is you're not thinking about you, but you're thinking about each of your clients, or each of the people that you're targeting. So if you're a mechanic that has a real estate, you're going to have 2 different brands, but the unifying brand is you, which becomes the bigger brand, which then makes you creating your own niche. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm thinking about how we might simplify that.
And that's why it's a public figure society, because right now we have AI doing all of this invisible workforce for us, thrusting us up to be able to have all of these passive incomes, to have all of these opportunities, and reach people in the different ways you want to do. And really, almost everyone's going to become an entrepreneur. Or they might have one job, but they want to be careful to continually educate themselves, because you never know what the next step is. And this is why building your brand and looking at your brand more as a corporate thing. So like, if you work for Chick-fil-A, right? If you're working for Chick-fil-A but you don't want to be there forever, because you don't know if it's going to last forever, you're going to want to get another education. You want to get another side thing to then make sure that you are on solid ground.
Yeah, I want to tap on this word passive income, which is often really misdiagnosed. People think that, it's passive, I just don't mess with it. That's not true. What it is it's that you get an income source in motion. If you can remember, being Gen Xers, we used to play on the playgrounds where we had these merry-go-rounds. Remember those?
Yeah.
And I don't think they're legal anymore. I think kids got hurt. But we would run, and then you jump on and you hang on with one arm, and you have this momentum going. And if you let it come to a complete stop, you had to start all over. But if you just, after every 5 or 6 rounds, if you just give it a good old kick, you keep all the momentum going. Remember that? That's really the idea of passive income. Passive income means that you've got momentum with it, and you're not having to just sit there and babysit it nonstop. When you talk about the personal corporate structure or personal, global corporation, what you're really describing is, as an individual, you've got to think about your financial world as your own little empire. You're going to have multiple business centers, multiple income centers. And hopefully each of those income centers is a passive income center where you can get momentum in it. And there's a lot of automation to it, which AI helps with and all the technology can help with. But, some people, let's just go the extreme of that. And I teach this in my course that I do on Financial Fortress. The extreme of that is you can have multiple sources of income and they're all active income. You can work at Sam's Club and you can work at another day job and you can have your weekend thing and you can also be doing eBay sales, and that's all active income. It requires you to really, really be active in everything you're doing. And so the path to freedom here, so it doesn't become, 1, 2, 3, many. I'm just an overload. The way you don't do that is you create automation inside those income structures. And to come back to your personal brand concept, what that really means is this idea of your personal brand is you call it you incorporated, or it's your empire of me, individual empire, whatever you want to call it. It's your personal world. And you have all these different things that you might do. So for like Donald Miller, he has Story Brand and he's got his coaching stuff that he does. These are different verticals that feed his little empire. But what you may not see is behind the scenes. I don't know, Donald, but I would assume that maybe he's got a bunch of real estate investments and a bunch of other things that are happening, and all of it is feeding into the thing. So what you're describing as a personal brand and this public figure society is you are now you're the CEO of this little mini empire. And that's the distinction that you're making, as opposed to maybe even just 10 years ago where the personal brand was, how do I position myself so that I'm an authority so that institutions will want to hire me. That was like a personal branding where you're positioning yourself. This is, no, I'm a personal brand. I run my own empire. I'm the CEO of my own universe now.
Right. And I think some people are going to say, well, I work for a company, so I don't need to do that. Well, you do need to think about yourself as a public figure because you have to stand out in the corporate structure, right? If this is what Carla Harris, who's an author of a book talking really about how an employee needs to stand out, because if you don't stand out, you lose when the rounds of firing goes or the rounds of things are going to have the layoffs because you haven't made a mark. So what's interesting now in the corporate world, you have to have the hat of a public figure on while you're serving a corporation in an old structure, because you never know when you can lose. So like if you're two bookkeepers, right? One bookkeeper has 50,000 followers and the other bookkeeper just has 0. What can happen in the future is that the corporation will pay the bookkeeper with 50,000 followers more because they can be an ambassador for the company. Or the bookkeeper says, no, I don't want to do it. I want to have the same pay. I'm going to keep my influencer brand as an insurance policy if you're going to end up laying me off. And that's really what you're seeing right now. The insurance policy for employees is to actually build your brand and
Yes.
look at your brand as a corporate structure where, and you're not going to want to give the LinkedIn real estate to your corporation, and you want to negotiate, am I going to get more money for doing that? Because you want to make sure that you can pivot if something should happen.
It gives you leverage. And that's what people have in the old model, the 20th century, people didn't realize how important it was to have leverage. In the new model, people are starting to learn that the public figure, as you're calling it, but that personal awareness, what people understand about who you are, that is your leverage. I'll use a really good example here. Trevor Bauer, who's a baseball pitcher, he used to pitch for the Los Angeles Dodgers, and there was a big scandal. They accused him, or a girl accused him of a bunch of inappropriate things. It all got dismissed, but he's never been invited back into Major League Baseball. And it's a tragic story. It really is. There was no charges ever filed. In fact, it was proven that the girl conspired against him. There was even text messages that proved that. That's beside the point. The point is this. Major League Baseball is afraid of Trevor Bauer because what Trevor was doing on the side is he was building his YouTube channel. And he has, I don't know, 1 million plus followers on YouTube. He actually has more followers on a video oftentimes than an average baseball game. So he has all this leverage, and he's got this incredible social following that say, hey, Major League Baseball and Rob Manfred, the great Satan of Major League Baseball, also known as the commissioner, is conspiring against Trevor Bauer. Well, here's where that carried over to. He goes and he plays in Japan. Japan looked at him. They paid him more than anybody else because what they realized is when we get Trevor Bauer, he brings with him all these fans. And so suddenly Americans are watching Japanese baseball that, frankly, we didn't hardly know existed. Fast forward a year, he goes to Mexico and he plays for a Mexican team. They say, we love your brand. We love your media. We want you to do it. So he's out there filming everything they're doing and pushing it out on YouTube and within his little media empire that he's built. And suddenly Trevor Bauer has all the leverage. And so that's a perfect example that Trevor has this leverage. He may or may not ever get to pitch again in Major League Baseball, but he has all this leverage that other institutions, other organizations, Mexican baseball, Japanese baseball, he's going back to Japan this year, they want him because of what he brings to the table outside of what he puts on the mound. Yeah, the mound is great. His performance as a skilled technician is great, but it's his ecosystem that he brings that is leverage. And that's the value of the public figure.
It is, and this is why even corporations have to look at themselves as a public figure. They have to be more personable to really reach the future. And I think this is where Jim Stenkel came out with a book, and right around the financial crisis, or a little bit before, but was a predictive modeling on you need to go back to purpose. A corporation has to go back to purpose because a corporation was founded by a person. So he transformed Max Factor, he transformed Pampers. He's one of the most profitable, powerful CMO that ever was in P&G, right? And his book Grow is fantastic. I mention it all the time because it really shows how you need to go back to purpose. A corporation needs to have personal traits. Yes, it can be a company, but it has to have that personality. And that's what public figure is so different, is that what you learn from Hollywood, and you are in the music industry as well, is that you know that you are a product and you are a person. You are positioning yourself out there for people to buy you with votes, followers, whatever. But at the same time, you can't get that without being the person, authentic, and who you are. And that is a very different way of thinking. You've not had to think like that before. No one has had to think like that before, but everyone has to think like that before. And what's interesting is in a society where everyone has to think like that, what does that actually entail?
Yeah, and to kind of carry on that, one of the things that's a huge shift from even 15 years ago, but certainly from 25 or 30 years ago, when I was coming of age in the late 90s and early 2000s, perfection was king. You just wanted position. Everything was about positioning. How do I make sure everything looks as polished as possible? And it carried over to everything. I mean, everything from your corporate branding to the way you dressed to the churches. Churches were all about perfection, right? They've perfected the worship service. It's all perfect, perfect, perfect. And today, this generation doesn't connect with that at all. And what I've often said is authenticity is greater than perfection. It used to be that you could compete on which company positioned itself better and looked more perfect. And today, that's not the truth. Today, it's the individual and the corporation that positions themselves as more authentic. People will take imperfections gladly because they can connect with the imperfection. They will not take a facade. What individuals want today more than anything, and the younger generations are just so finely tuned to this, they want authenticity. They want what's real. They don't even care what's real. They just want the truth. They don't want any more of this facade BS. No more polished. Authenticity is king.
So authenticity is king. We're going to end it there. We're going to have to go into phase 3. But what's really good, what we learned here today, if you want to summarize a little bit for me, is helping you see that you're in the season of winter. You've got 4 years to define. Doesn't mean it's just 4 years, but it's 4 years where it's the optimal moment for you. And that you're going to need to unlearn, to learn and relearn new things, learn. It's going to be a very tension place right now. And that you as a person is a public figure. We're going to go a little bit more into detail on that in part 3, but really it's about authenticity. It's about finding your corporate structure of you Inc., which is really what we're going to talk about next.
Thank you for listening to the Public Figure Society podcast, where innovation meets influence. If you love this episode, be sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a review. Connect with us on social media and join the conversation. Until next time, keep innovating, keep influencing, and we'll see you in the next episode.